طاب يومكم. أنا الياس قطار، مسؤول النشر والتحرير في المجلس العربي للعلوم الاجتماعية. أهلا بكم وبكنا في حلقتين نقاش ينظمهما المجلس العربي للعلوم الاجتماعية بالتعاون مع منظمة اليونسكو حول العلوم الإنسانية النقدية في المنطقة العربية، أجندات وممارسات. تعقد الحلقة الأولى الآن، والحلقة الثانية في تمام الساعة 4 من بعد الظهر بتوقيت بيروت. الترجمة الفورية إلى العربية والإنجليزية متاحة للمشاركين والمشاركات عبر منصة زوم. كما نشجعكم على طرح أسئلتكم في خانة سؤال وجواب Q&A على زوم، وفي تعليق كومنت للمتابعين والمتابعات عبر صفحتنا في فيسبوك حيث تبث هذه الحلقة. الآن أترك كلمة الترحيب إلى السيدة أنجيلا ميلو، مديرة سياسات وبرامج العلوم الاجتماعية والإنسانية لمنظمة اليونسكو. تفضلي سيدة ميلو. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning. Greetings from Paris. Estimate colleagues and attendees, it is a great pleasure to represent UNESCO in this special event, regional event, to showcase the outcomes of the fruitful collaboration between UNESCO Social and Human Sciences program of our regional office for sciences in Arab states and in Arab Council for the Social Sciences. I hope that my remarks will provide some useful insights and will help to shed light on UNESCO's Social and Human Sciences regional program and sector aimed at joining efforts in the region to promote and strengthening the social sciences and humanities in the Arab region. I commend you for selecting timely topics of the great gravity. Allow me to say that as UNESCO, we are very proud to collaborate with such a dedicated and impactful organization such as the Arab Council for Social Sciences, ACSS, that works rigorously to strengthening social science research and knowledge production in the Arab region. By supporting researchers and academic researchers institutions, our collaboration with the ACSS is aiming to contribute to the creation, dissemination, validation, and utilization of science, social science research, and to enrich public debates about the challenges facing Arab societies. All this is a part of the implementation of the UNESCO recommendation on science and scientific researchers adopted in 2017. We wish such efforts will enhance the role of social sciences in Arab public life and inform public policy in the region to boost the life of people. It is always the main goal of UNESCO's social science programs to understand the complexity of the societal phenomena and its dynamics towards social transformations and providing efficient responses in supporting UNESCO's member states. Supporting member states to discuss pressing topics through the data collection and analysis of a wide range of themes in humanities, the social sciences, and arts in order to achieve a positive change and actual progress in societies is aligned with the social and human sciences mandates at UNESCO. In fact, social sciences and humanities are crucial for UNESCO's sector to foster our understanding of social progress and inclusion, to enable people and institutions to create and use knowledge for just and inclusive societies. Multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary nature of the social and human sciences offer key inputs for UNESCO's SHS programs priorities targeting social inclusion and sustainable development. Humanities field anchored in the SHS provide essentials ingredients to its programs to promote reference to humanistic and critical thinking in the responding to social transformations. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not the first collaboration between UNESCO and SHS and ACSS. In July 2018, the ACSS developed an Arabic language volume, including 10 of the papers prepared by Biblos in Liège meetings. In addition, a virtual forum on the humanities in Arab region was held jointly with UNESCO Beirut and International Center on Human Sciences, CISH. The UNESCO's Category 2 Center in Lebanon on April 6 to 7, 2021, in which the focus was on where and how the humanities are being produced institutionally, universities and research centers, as well as through efforts of informal collectives and research groups. Currently, UNESCO Cairo and ACSS are working on several essays that will present critical social topics, including feminism, urban management, inequalities, and inclusion. I'm sure the prominent authors will elaborate on each theme in details later during these interventions. UNESCO Cairo ACSS collaboration is also working on surveying 25 profiles of institutions and organizations working on humanities in the region to update the existing mapping of critical humanities institutions and platforms working in the region and highlight their contributions in the following activities: alternative news production, arts and culture, urban development and activism initiatives, feminist funding and solidarity building, interfaith studies, and film. I'd like to commend the social and human sciences teams at UNESCO, Beirut, and Cairo offices for their collaboration with the Arab Council for the Social Sciences during 2020-2022 to critically and creatively examine themes, research methods, pedagogies, people, modes, and institutions that are involved in shaping and reshaping humanities knowledge in and on the region. Esteemed colleagues and attendees, interventions during the day will address institutions and infrastructures of the production of knowledge, the definition and reformulations of humanities fields, the intersections of research with society, the idea of the public good, and the ways in which innovative collaborations and new disciplines are emerging. Finally, given the realities of the current global changes, including the COVID-19 pandemic on the region, the webinars also speak to notions of crisis, urgency, emergency, and the ways in which they impact academic and public knowledge production. We hope this collaboration will allow us to reach several audiences in the region, including scholars and academics, university leadership and administration, state-based policymakers, non-state agencies and NGOs, funders, and general public. Congratulations once again on this successful collaboration and my best wishes for this successful event. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
شكرا سيدة ميلو على مشاركتك معنا اليوم وعلى هذه الكلمات. الآن ننتقل إلى كلمة المديرة العامة للمجلس العربي للعلوم الاجتماعية الدكتورة ستاني شامي. تفضلي دكتورة ستاني.
Shukran, Ilyas. Thank you so much, Ms. Angela Melo. We are really honored to have you with us in this first webinar and one of a series, we hope, that will be showcasing the work that ACSS is doing together with UNESCO. I will switch to Arabic now. I will repeat some of what you have already presented to us, because I think these ideas bear some repeating and discussion. The importance of the many ways in which the humanities can help us understand and shape realities in our region. I will switch to Arabic now. There is interpretation available. مرحبا بالجميع. شكرا للسيدة أنجيلا ميلو، شكرا لمنظمة اليونسكو. كما ذكرت السيدة ميلو، هناك تعاون وثيق بين المجلس العربي للعلوم الاجتماعية ومنظمة اليونسكو عبر المقر الرئيسي لليونسكو في باريس، وكذلك عبر مكاتبها في بيروت والقاهرة. فنشكر منظمة اليونسكو على دعمكم واهتمامكم بعملنا وعلى كل ما تفعلونه وتنجزونه لصالح العلوم الإنسانية والاجتماعية. أود أن أرحب بجميع المشاركات في هاتين الحلقتين النقاشتين، واللتين سنعرض فيهما العمل الذي قام به المجلس العربي في مجال العلوم الإنسانية على مدار السنوات الماضية. هاتان الحلقتان اليوم هما بداية لسلسلة حلقات سيتم تنظيمها خلال الأشهر المقبلة هذا العام. لطالما اعتمد المجلس العربي للعلوم الاجتماعية تعريفاً واسعاً للعلوم الاجتماعية، بما في ذلك العلوم الإنسانية وكذلك المجالات متعددة التخصصات ذات الصلة، مثل الدراسات الحضرية والدراسات الجندرية والدراسات الصحية وسواها. وانطلاقاً من عام 2016 بدأ المجلس بتنظيم برامج وبحوث في مجال العلوم الإنسانية بشكل محدد، وكذلك في مجال الفنون والثقافة بشكل عام. والعديد من هذه المشاريع تنظم بالتعاون مع منظمات شقيقة أخرى في لبنان والمنطقة وكذلك حول العالم. على سبيل المثال، نظم المجلس مع الصندوق العربي للثقافة والفنون آفاق 4 دورات تمويل لمنح ضمن برنامج البحوث حول الفنون. كما يتعاون المجلس مع مؤسسة اتجاهات ثقافة مستقلة في أحد برامجها البحثية، ونعمل أيضاً مع الجامعة الأمريكية في بيروت على تطوير أرشيف جندري للتاريخ الشفوي. حلقتا اليوم هما ثمرة سلسلة معينة من الأنشطة والتعاون. فالمجلس العربي للعلوم الاجتماعية شارك في تنظيم منتدى إقليمي للعلوم الإنسانية بالتعاون مع المركز الدولي لعلوم الإنسان في جبيل بيبلس لبنان، ومع اليونسكو في بيروت في عام 2017 وفي عام 2021. كما شارك المجلس في مؤتمر العلوم الإنسانية العالمي في لييج بلجيكا في عام 2017. في أعقاب هذا المؤتمر تمت دعوة المجلس للمساهمة في التقرير العالمي للعلوم الإنسانية World Humanities Report، وإنتاج الجزء المتصل بالمنطقة العربية في هذا التقرير. ويتم إعداد هذا التقرير العالمي من قبل اتحاد مراكز ومعاهد العلوم الإنسانية Consortium of Humanities Centers and Institutes، جنباً إلى جنب مع المجلس الدولي للفلسفة والعلوم الإنسانية سيبش، وبالتعاون مع اليونسكو. العروض التقديمية والمداخلات في حلقتي اليوم هي جزء من نتائج العمل على تقرير العلوم الإنسانية للمنطقة العربية، والذي يتألف من 25 مقالة واستطلاع شمل 25 منظمة تعمل في مجال العلوم الإنسانية عبر بلدان المنطقة. وسيتم نشر هذه المخرجات باللغة الإنجليزية من قبل التقرير العالمي للعلوم الإنسانية Humanities Report، وسيتم النشر باللغة العربية من قبل المجلس العربي للعلوم الاجتماعية. فخلال الفترة ما بين 2020 و 2021 حفز المجلس العربي للعلوم الاجتماعية باحثين وباحثات من جميع أنحاء المنطقة وخارجها لإجراء معاينة ودراسة نقدية وابتكارية للثيمات ومناهج البحث ووسائل التدريس والأشخاص والأنماط والمؤسسات المنخرطة في تشكيل وإعادة تشكيل المعرفة في العلوم الإنسانية في المنطقة وعنها. يهدف التقرير إلى إرساء فهم نقدي لمشهد وأثر استحداث المعرفة في العلوم الإنسانية على المؤسسات والباحثين والجمهور. تتناول المقالات ودراسات الحالة المقدمة البنى التحتية لإنتاج المعرفة، تعريف مجالات العلوم الإنسانية وإعادة صياغتها، تقاطعات البحث مع المجتمع، فكرة الصالح العام، والوسائل التي ينشأ من خلالها التعاون المبتكر والحقول المعرفية الجديدة. أخيراً، نظراً إلى وقائع المنطقة، تتحدث المقالات أيضاً عن مفاهيم الأزمة وزمن الطوارئ وكيفية تأثيرها على إنتاج المعرفة الأكاديمية والعامة. يتوزع التقرير على 4 أقسام تتناول المحاور الآتية: أولاً، الهيمنات المتراكمة والمخيلة الأكاديمية. ثانياً، المعرفة في زمن الطوارئ. ثالثاً، المنصات النسوية. ورابعاً، الترجمة والكتابة عبر الأنماط والأنواع. وستقدم حلقتا اليوم بعض المقالات التي تندرج في محوري المعرفة في زمن الطوارئ والمنصات النسوية. وتم تصميم التقرير العالمي للعلوم الإنسانية لتعزيز فهم مساهمات العلوم الإنسانية في المعرفة والمجتمع في جميع أنحاء العالم، وتقديم توصيات للعلوم الإنسانية في القرن ال21. للمشروع جماهير عديدة، بما في ذلك العلماء والأكاديميون، قيادات الجامعات، صانعو السياسات على مستوى الدولة والمنظمات غير الحكومية، الممولين والجمهور العام. لذا نتطلع إلى مساهمة مجدية ومفيدة من المنطقة العربية في هذه الأهداف العالمية. لابد من أن أقدم شكراً وامتنانا لجميع الذين عملوا في هذا المشروع، ومن بينهم الأستاذات هدى الصدى وديمة قائد بيه ومنيرة حب الله في فريق التحرير، وريم جودي وهنا شلتوت وتمار سليمان في فريق البحث. وسيشارك عدد منهن في حلقتي اليوم وفي الحلقات المستقبلية أيضاً. إذن شكراً مجدداً لجميع المشاركات المتحدثات ولشريكنا مكتب اليونسكو في القاهرة الذين يدعمون هذا العمل منذ البداية. وأخيراً شكراً لكل من انضم إلينا على زوم وفيسبوك. نبدأ بحلقة النقاش الأولى حول إنتاج المعرفة في زمن الطوارئ، والمتحدثات في هذه الحلقة الأولى هن ريم جودي باحثة في المجلس العربي للعلوم الاجتماعية، مزنى المصري من مجموعة أبلة البحثية، ميم أبو مغلي من مركز الدراسات اللبنانية. وستكون المداخلات باللغة الإنجليزية. أذكركم بأن الترجمة متوفرة موجودة للغة العربية، وأن النقاش يمكن أن يكون وطرح الأسئلة يمكن أن يكون بالعربية أو بالإنجليزية. فنبدأ مع ريم جودي. تفضلي ريم، 15 دقيقة لو سمحت.
Good afternoon, everybody. مساء الخير الجميع. The paper that I will be presenting looks at intersections between affect, archive, digital media platforms, and the afterlives of conflict in the context of Lebanon. So the Lebanese Civil War was a violent and traumatic event that left its mark on bodies, on lives, livelihoods, and the country's physical infrastructure. Its aftermath was characterized by a state-sponsored amnesia that sought to expunge the violent events from public discourse, ensuring that their erasure from national history textbooks and public discussion more generally. The Ta'if Agreement and the amnesty law that followed the war established a sectarian ruling system that failed to provide a national framework for closure or resolution. Rather, the laws ensured that the former militiamen and warlords' unimpeded transition to power. The unresolved trauma of the war and the sociopolitical uncertainties that shrouded the future produced the present as a protracted moment of crisis and precarity. This moment is similar to what Lauren Berlant characterizes as an impasse. which he says is, quote, a time of dithering from which someone or some situation, situation cannot move forward, end quote. This impasse, according to Berlant, is shaped by the destabilizing effect of neoliberal economic practices and capitalist activity, insofar as daily life becomes precarious. Importantly for this study, the impasse is experienced as an affective encounter, mediated by a feeling of loss that is, quote, collective, material, and phantasmic, end quote. It produces a class that Berlant terms the precariats, who are bound by an affective solidarity of their shared loss, as well as their political imaginaries for a different future. I'm particularly interested in exploring the relationship between loss and nostalgic imaginaries in the context of post-war Lebanon. Looking at the relationship between media memory and war, Zaina Tarraf argues that, quote, nostalgia functions as an affective register deeply implicated in the Lebanese post-war ordinary, end quote. It is a register that helps shape national publics and illuminates various modes of national belonging that are all also articulated through loss. Thinking through the framework of the impasse and nostalgia as an affective register, I look at how memory and nation are fragmented and reframed through digital media platforms and content. In the absence of a national archive to preserve memories of the past, how do emergent digital archives on Instagram reimagine modes of national belonging in Lebanon? I look at two accounts specifically, Old Beirut Lebanon and Walls of Thawra. I argue that these pages produce alternative political imaginaries and national belongings through their affective engagements with the past, but also the present and the future, and how they destabilize these temporal vectors. I argue that the images circulated on the two Instagram accounts also engage with the afterlives of state-making projects in Lebanon. So Old Beirut Lebanon is an account that was founded in 2012. It is run by one person and curated by one person who compiles archival images of Beirut and other Lebanese cities that he finds from existing archives such as Tali Liban, photographers, and other such sources. Walls of Thawra, on the other hand, was created during the October 17, 2019 uprisings to document the various creative, political, and urban expressions and changes that were occurring in Beirut at the time. So the account posts many images of graffiti, wall art, and other such creative interventions. So there are several points of connections between them that interested me. The first is the fact that they were both assembled through individual efforts to collect, share, and caption the different images. They appear to operate on an ad hoc basis rather than following a clear archival methodology. Secondly, they are both felt archives. They're produced through emotional engagements with a particular historical moment, and they encourage users to also have their own emotional engagements with the images through liking, sharing, or commenting. Third, both accounts are connected by a form of linguistic hybridity. The captions are predominantly in English, but they do mix Arabic and English in the photos and in the captions, and they also assume a familiarity with the Lebanese local dialect, with the country's political history and its culture. And lastly, while both pages I'm looking at comment on different time periods, one explicitly on the past and another is more recent, they exist within the same contemporary moment and across the shared digital platform, and they operate within this protracted civil war. So I look at nostalgia through a theoretical framework that interlaces the work of Svetlana Boym and Sara Ahmed. Boym identifies two forms of nostalgia: restorative, which looks to construct a unified narrative of the past, and reflective, which looks to understand the past through a critical lens. She notes that these two often work together to shape engagements with the past. And for Ahmed, I'm focusing specifically on her work on the cultural politics of emotion, where she notes that emotions are cultural states through which bodies acquire meaning. She says, quote, through emotions, the past remains on the surface of bodies. They show how histories stay alive even when they are not consciously remembered, end quote. And these emotions can also open up political futures through reorienting individuals and collectives. In interlacing these two frameworks, I want to begin to unpack several questions. First, I want to look at how both Instagram pages conceptualize nostalgia. What are the affective pulls they inspire? How do these dynamics reshape understandings of the archive as we traditionally understand it? What are the emotions that are mobilized? And what do the emotions do in this digital media landscape that I'm looking at? And what can be said about future political imaginaries as a result? So a discussion of these two pages cannot be removed from the broader context that shaped the post-2011 Arab world. So documentations of the revolutions that are unfolded across the region was enabled to a certain extent by digital technologies and infrastructures, and several pages and accounts emerged that aimed to either archive these changes. Several pages also emerged on Facebook and Instagram that freed up images, historical images as well. The trope of nostalgia and images reflecting the past were also very much available then. So this political moment was also transformative in that the archive was not only about classification and categorization, but also about the politics and processes that were shaping it at the same time. So the way that this digital archive is shaped is both material and affective. Material because there is a physical infrastructure that houses and transports data, that these platforms are owned by large corporations, algorithms analyze user preferences and decide what can be seen and what should remain hidden. But it's also affective in how users interact with it, the emotional attachments that they produce to the images or the content, the geographic boundlessness of this space that allows an archive to transcend physical and national borders and to take on multiple afterlives, both online and offline. So in the absence of this a national archive to engage in Lebanon's recent history, I want to examine how a platform like Instagram can destabilize engagements with the past and stretch our understandings of traditional archival practices. So in order to map out this affective landscape that emerges from the selected archives, the two that I mentioned, I contextualize them within and through different historical time periods. I argue specifically that they engage with two state-making projects. The first is Fuad Shahab's presidency from 1958 to 1964. And this time period is sometimes considered the starting point of Beirut's golden age, when it was nicknamed the Paris of the Middle East. So according to Fawaz Trabulsi, Shahab's presidency was characterized by a, quote, unifying and egalitarian, unquote, version of Lebanese nationalism, and considered one of the strongest examples of state building in Lebanon's modern history, as it was an attempt to lay the institutional groundwork that is needed to operate and imagine a nation state. The second state-making project I look at is Rafiq Hariri's model of neoliberal urbanism. And I look at two things in particular. The first is the post-war reconstruction of Beirut, and specifically the large-scale urban reconstruction of downtown Beirut through the company Solidaire, and an important economic policy, which was the anchoring of the currency, the Lebanese local currency, to the US dollar. So Rafiq Hariri's policies were heavily critiqued in public discourse, especially following his assassination in 2005 and the political instability that followed. While some viewed his policies as a strong effort at rebuilding a war-torn country, others critiqued and pointed out the corruption, the numerous property and land infringements that he committed, the aggressive privatization of Lebanon's shores that occurred. And the debate surrounding Hariri's political and economic policies reemerged during the October 17 uprisings in 2019. Some activists, scholars, members of the public discussed the negative effects of, for example, the Lebanese lira to US dollar peg, and that the corruption and his unregulated access to large infrastructure contracts under the Council of Development and Reconstruction laid the foundations for the country's current financial and economic collapse. And what interests me about these two particular projects is that they were marked by interruption, whether through resignation due to rising political tensions, as was the case with Shahab, or assassination. And the important point to consider is not whether these projects would have been successful or not. Rather, it is the promise of what could have been and the ways in which they haunt political imaginaries today. And this haunting, I argue, is affective and lived. It's a condition that is exacerbated by living through an impasse. It generates an emotional response, and it demands us to reflect on the present and asks us to do something about it. There is a realization that something can no longer hold, but the conditions of rebuilding or what to do are less clear. So to go specifically into discussion of both accounts, so I'll start with Old Beirut, Lebanon. So the account mostly posts photographs from the 1950s and 60s, though some are older and some are during the Civil War. They show images of downtown Beirut prior to the Civil War, of public transport systems like the tramway that existed, green spaces, a public coastline that was accessible, that is today things that are today unrecognizable due to rampant urbanization and privatization. There are photographs of crafts and trades that have died out, and these are all affective engagements with loss of what could have been and what was potentially there at the time. And to use Boehm's conceptualization, the page represents how both restorative and reflective nostalgia can work together to produce affective engagements with the photographs. Some user comments lament on how life was much better in the good old days. It is Allah is one of the words that's heavily repeated under many of the photographs. Other content on the page comments on the present through the past and vice versa, nuancing understandings of both and looking at them critically. Sometimes people engaging openly criticize the dangers of Lebanon's sectarian power sharing system. Sometimes they criticize the violence of the civil war. Phrases like "may it be remembered but never repeated," "tinzakar ma tin'ad," are common. The emotions expressed demonstrate how the past remains in people's psyches and people's bodies in the built and urban environment, how these histories are alive even when they want to be forgotten. And it also highlights how these affective engagements mobilize nostalgia as a way to possibly imagine a different future, and perhaps are a way to think about, whether expressly or otherwise, an unfinished opportunity of Shahab's political project. So moving on to Walls of Thawra, the images of graffiti on Walls of Thawra account effectively chart out alternative political imaginaries. This archive is born out of the urgency of documenting the October 17 uprisings and reflects an anticipated nostalgia almost for a moment that is fleeting and a fear that its political potential will not materialize. So there is a need to hold on. This urgency invites a forward-looking perspective. What if these images remained accessible for future generations? Would they use them? And if so, when and how? The 2019 uprisings can be read as symptomatic of the post-war neoliberal project's collapse, resulting in the devaluation of the local currency and compounding socioeconomic crises. The account posts photos of a destroyed ATM machines, slogans like "Eat the Rich" graffitied on the walls of Beirut, stencils denigrating the International Monetary Fund. These all can be read as critiques of these post-war neoliberal policies that Rafiq Hariri was an advocate of, and for some, a symbol of as well. And the strong language used on this account, it's rife with emotions like anger, like grief, like frustration. It highlights how affect can be an important tool to bring national publics together, regardless of class or sect affiliation. As Ahmed argues, slogans and symbols are powerful cultural vectors that not only generate emotional responses, but also use these responses to elicit or encourage political action. In the case of the October 17 uprisings, this included the occupation and reappropriation and reclamation of downtown Beirut as a public space, a symbolic response to Solidarity's reconstruction project that made it a space accessible to a privileged few. So my discussion of the two Instagram pages, I hope, has parsed out preliminary threads of the relationship between affect, nostalgia, and Instagram archives in Lebanon. In the post-war, post-Arab Spring, post-October 17 uprisings context, the question of what next or what comes next looms heavy. Perhaps what the analysis of both accounts highlights is the stickiness of the sectarian power sharing system as an oppressive structure that frames daily life in Lebanon. Whether it's the images on old Beirut Lebanon that show what was lost or what could have been, or Walls of Thawra's desire to actively call for the dissolution of a sectarian system, systemic change remains a persistent theme across both. And so it is difficult to break away from the status quo, even when it breaks you down. There's this heightened sense of loss compounded by a fear of future losses. It may be the feeling, the affective bind, or of a perceived cultural moment of unity that both Instagram pages offer through their public and accessible platforms that allow individuals and groups to think together, to mourn together, to perhaps forge new alliances and solidarities, and maybe in doing so, to create the bases of future revolutionary projects. Maybe that's a little bit of a hopeful reading, but it's just to highlight the importance of these pages, of these cultural projects that do something, and maybe to think about what they can do and what their potential can be. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your comments and feedback.
Thank you so much, ريم. شكرا ريم. ننتقل مباشرة إلى عرض مزن المصري تفضلي مصنع 15 دقيقة.
سلامات جميعا. Thank you, Satane. I will speak in English, but before that I just have a couple of words in Arabic. بداية بدي أعتذر إنه ما عم بحكي بالعربي، اللغة العربية. كان في طلب ونحن يعني أنا دايما بقدر الفرصة إنه نحكي بالعربي مع جمهور عم يسمعنا بالأساس باللغة العربية، ولضيق الوقت ولأن الورقة كانت مكتوبة بالأساس باللغة الإنجليزية مجبورة أحكيها إنجليزي. بس شعري مش بالذنب، بعتذر منكم جميعا. أظن الأولوية كانت إنه أحكيها بالعربي. مرتجي صارت معنا وقت أكثر. So I'm going to move back to English, if okay. What I will be talking about today is also the paper for this on witnessing. It was titled then Witnessing the Emergence of Future Worlds, or how do we do research, ethnographic research in particular in turbulent times. Let me just start by what I think the moment we're in now, because I reread what I've written a year ago, and it seems maybe it's more to the point. It seems like it has changed a lot, but that's exactly the idea, is that we are in a very volatile, very changing context. And so what is our role as researchers? And I would say we are the dominant context we're in as a context of despair. Context of despair that after 10 years of speaking of revolutions, political contestation, we are still sending our people through boats from our shores are still taking citizens of these Arab countries to Europe that is closing its doors. We still don't have electricity in Lebanon. Our friends in Egypt and in Syria are still in prison or have disappeared and haven't reappeared. I'm a member of this Facebook group that I joined some 8 years ago. It was about trying to find routes to Europe and trying to help immigrants that are going by sea when they're in a problem. It has 400,000 members and it's still going on really strongly, and it still shows where we are at the moment. So within this context of despair, this is what I'm looking for, the role of the researcher. I'm not looking for the role of the social scientist in general. I'm just zooming in on exactly what can research do at a moment like this, what can critical research do in a moment of despair like the one we're living in. So I will spare you the details of the fieldwork realities, the change in it, that you probably all know of it, and the realities of the region. And just to take you there to just clarify what I'm not talking about. So when we're talking about research in turbulent times or in moments of crisis, a lot of it is about the practicalities of it. How do we deal with fear, our positionality as researchers, the ethics of our engagement? This is not what I'm concerned about. And this has been covered by a lot of people, including May, who's with us here too. And the question is more about what is our role? Like, what do we add to that discussion? And there are in the social sciences a couple of known responsibilities. We know that, for example, Shaffer Hughes in her classic article speaks about our responsibility to be public intellectuals, to take sides, to make judgments. But I think this form of engagement is a bit of a privilege in a context where we are already de facto engaged in our context. Our very way of life, our future is enmeshed in the realities of the field we're studying. And more importantly, I think the question is, how do we take sides? The problem is that the solutions, the answers that we can provide as social scientists elude us. So it's an invitation to a bit of humility in saying, actually, we don't have the answers at this moment of turmoil, but how are we going to go about to at least engage the questions, okay? And we know a lot of people have asked us to take on that role of being public intellectuals, to answer, to predict. And I'm sure some will be able, but I'm taking the side of if we don't have the answers, what else can we do? What can we provide? So I've with the start of the protests in Lebanon, I've tried 3 roles that anthropology or ethnography speaks of. And I will advocate for the 3rd of these. But the first is of the ethnographer as keeper of the record. And that's a classic role for anthropologists. We are witnesses of the everyday life. And that's what we did at the beginning of the protests, sat in the squares, noted the conversations, noted who is present, noted the kind of moments of contact. But soon, there was a very vibrant moment. Even research people who are outside of the squares, who are not coming to the demonstrations, why are they not coming? But that scene was changing very quickly. And soon that scene sort of disappeared. It no longer existed, that space. I was a sole researcher then. I had lots of notes. I had recordings of the events. But then what do you do with that? That project of being a keeper of the record requires a different kind of institution. Required engagement not only by a sole researcher, it required a university maybe to take that on and say, at these moments we're in, this is a cumulative effort that we want to work on together, that we take on, okay? So I'm not saying dismissing this as a role, but so if we want to be witnesses or clerks of the records, following like the question is, it's not a simplistic task. It's a much bigger task than choosing it for ourselves. And particularly when we know that we are at the moment, as ethnographers, researchers, we know very well that at any moment we're working in anchors itself, as Reem showed us now, in a longer kind of history. That if we want to record analytically and critically, we know it's not like just one present moment we want to take on. The other task is the ethnographer as bridge builder. So in a time of binaries and a lot of conflict, we attempted through research to create spaces where we present the multiple realities that we heard in the field to people from different places. So in one research we were doing, we interviewed like 40, 50 people from different political sides, and then we invite them to a presentation of what we've heard. And we assumed or hoped that that discussion will bring them away from a discourse that they were hearing in the media, from a very, from that kind of opposition that they lived through, and that it would allow them to come together and to hear each other's points of view. There were some similar kind of attempts with the start of the Syrian refugee crisis. There's lots of quantitative and qualitative research was conducted or commissioned by development organizations on the like on the impact of Syrian conflict in Lebanon, monitoring Lebanese perceptions of Syrian refugees, trying to find ways to foster social cohesion or social stability in UN lingo. And it wanted to like explain that kind of terrain, create that kind of the discussion. But in that sense, it's like, it's a very small role that we can play. It's a very small audience who's willing then to hear that kind of conversation. The conversations we've had have always remained polite. Some of these were already online because with COVID had started, but it was not the kind of dialogue that we hoped research would initiate. And plus, again, it was a sort of limited in time as an event, and there were a few events like this, not many. But it was, in all cases, a reminder for us as researchers to accept anthropology's invitation to study beyond the familiar, to like that, we have that gift. That like in like these kinds of political moments, how do we ensure as researchers that we do not invite omission of certain voices, that are outside of the binary, outside of the discussion of power and resistance, and to appreciate ethnography's comfort, or if not even conflict, it's the way it embraces the complexity and allows us for more nuanced depiction of what's happening on the ground. And so I take this on, and I go back to a third role, which I think that's a role that I think is key, and it answers again to the context we're in, which is the context of despair. So it's not the question only of what do we provide as researchers in moments of crisis. It's a crisis now of the inability to see the future in the moment we're in, and in the inability to imagine a different political reality. A feeling of defeat that is very prominent, I would say. It's like in Lebanon, particularly, like the succession of events in the past 2 years cast a very morbid shadow on most of the work that I have done and the field notes that I have. If you look at the conversations we've had, there is, of course, the Lebanese currency crisis, the economic difficulties that come out of this, the Beirut blast and its effects, the frequent power cuts, the fuel crisis, medicinal shortages, and that's only to name but a few. For a long time after the blast, neighbors and friends were still discussing about the moments when it started raining glass in their neighborhood, or saying how the colors of the sunset setting in the Mediterranean are triggering remembrance of the blast. Lebanon today, I'd say, as many countries in the region, can offer another story about suffering, which anthropology has concerned itself with it all too often. It's a story of a suspended revolution against an exploitative neoliberal regime. But I'm also driven to not tell that story, but try to search for a different kind of story. I go back to, very often I go back to the work of Ghassan Haj on the tradition, the critical tradition and the social sciences, where he compares the sociological tradition, critical sociological tradition, and the anthropological critical perspective. He differentiates the sociological tradition in his perspective uncovers relations of power and processes of domination, whereas the anthropological one considers alternative realities and spaces that lie outside of domination and resistance. It is, in a way, anthropology's gift that is allowing us to consider, and I quote Haj, possibility of being other than what we are and opening up new imaginaries of the future that could lie ahead. So in the density of experiences we've experienced in the past few years, relationships of domination are very hard to miss. So we could engage in uncovering the impact of the neoliberal system, but I think any lay person on the street now knows that really well. There's the crisis, I'd say now and elsewhere in the region, is a crisis of political imagination. That has hegemony over people's imaginations and leads us to being unable to anticipate or even imagine an alternative future. So how can we bring that? A different engagement with the world of our fields of research and with the people we learn from can allow us to discern these other possibilities. Haj in the Square in 2019 also invited us as anthropologists to discern in what exists the possibility of the future, to note as ethnographers what is emerging in the cracks of existing reality. In practice, and that's what I tried to translate a little bit in practice in my work, it's reframing our research questions and how we approach the field. This is not the positivist kind of pursuit or, of hope or the promises of the future or Sunna al-Amal, as some of our politicians in the Arab world would say, or the future that Hariri promised us some 25 years ago that is a form of cruel optimism. But it's actually one of like looking through the swamp of the reality we live in for the things that are life-giving and to learn from the people. So it's not my political imagination that I'm searching for. It's in research, what political imagination, socio-political imagination is emerging, and how can we as researchers capture that? How can we capture moments of possibility, or like the way Majd Kayal, in talking about the revolts in Jerusalem last year, described as لحظة الممكن. How can we catch these? There's echoes of this a lot in anthropology in the past few years, in the many conferences that had future in their titles, but I've also found it very useful in, for example, my current work on infrastructure and electricity. Jasanoff and Kim, for example, in their book in 2015, Dreamscapes of Modernity, speak about that kind of a socio-technical imaginary, but it can also be a socio-political imaginary as a collectively held, institutionally stabilized, and publicly performed visions of desirable futures that are animated by shared understandings of forms and social life and social order. And with that kind of description of what, and according to Jasanoff and Kim, it's that kind of imaginary that makes even socio-technical changes possible, in the sense that a science fiction movie predates usually the socio-technical kind of inventions that make that imagination of that movie possible 10 years later. And in that sense, I think that in the field, there are many of these existing imaginaries. So it's like, it's trying to look actually more to the field, to the everyday, to the ethnographic, so that we can bring back the larger, the different imagination of that desirable future. I'll give a quick example, like a bit of in practice. I've been doing, I don't know how much time I still have, I've been doing research in Burj Al Barajne in the past year on electricity and water infrastructure. And it's one of, this picture behind me is from the camp. It's one of the very problematic places for infrastructure. So take the problems of electricity and water in Lebanon, and then times 10, take the political problems related to water and electricity in Lebanon, then again, multiply that by 10. So of course, we could speak about the many people who are dying because of the electricity problems, and that's a reality. We can speak about the kind of health impact of polluted water, polluted and salty water. We can speak about the corruption of NGOs and UN agencies responsible for that infrastructure. We can speak about the Palestinian internal conflict between the different factions and the inability to manage that infrastructure, the impact of the national political context, the exclusion of Palestinians from the Lebanese systems of power in the camp, the kind of the political Palestinian bickering that creates the kind of tension between the pro-Hamas and pro-Fatah groups, and the inability to manage. And those are all real. The stress, the everyday stress as an anthropologist of women having to manage all of these. But after that period of research, taking on that kind of promise of how can we see what is emerging from the cracks. So instead we took on the role of saying, what has happened in the past 10 years in the camp that creates within it the possibility of a different way of dealing with energy. And in that sense, we did research on all attempts over these 10 years to find a solution for infrastructure problems in the camp, and heard from people as to what is it they tried, what made it possible, and also to see what kind of structures that kind of desire enabled. And in that sense, you could see in the camp the entanglements of wire, and they're really hard to escape. And nobody in the camp needed me to tell them that, but you could also see that there's always on every window there you would find a woman that plants something that gives life within that context. And there we try to find that actually the the Palestinian diaspora, if organized around the villages and the village committees, they actually have a key role. That there has been persistent kind of attempts by a set of 10 to 12 people that can actually bring together their commitment and their accumulated experience. You could find new ways of thinking of funding community projects. So this is just an example of how we, just to end this, I think there is a promise there, okay? And that's our task at hand as researchers, to have that kind of practice of anthropology that is speculative, attentive to the emergent moment, that is accepting of uncertainty and open to possibility, and paves new paths. It's what Pandian describes as a creative anthropology, one that shares in the transformative powers of experience and the genesis of the world we witness. But maybe it's for us now together to think what kind of institutions does that kind of promise need for us to carry? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Muzna. Shukran. We move directly, because we're running a little bit late, we move directly to May Abu Mokri. تفضلي مي.
شكرا ستنا. بس بدي أكد على النقطة اللي طرحتها زميلتي مزنة بالأول. أنا بعتذر إني ما رح أحكي باللغة العربية، وإن شاء الله يكون في فرص تانية إني أقدر أحكي عن الورقة تبعتي باللغة العربية. Thank you very much to the Arab Council for Social Sciences for inviting me to speak today. And my presentation or my paper focuses on education and emergencies, or the industry that's called education emergencies, and the research part of education in emergencies, and how it's becoming more and more a contested terrain. Education emergencies is an umbrella term used to cover the variety of formal and non-formal educational activities taking place during an emergency, be it a natural disaster or a conflict, and most recently in context of regional or global pandemics such as Ebola and COVID-19. Education emergencies is a relatively a young field, and the most recent emergence of the field followed the 1990 World Conference on Education for All, and what's consolidated during the 2000 World Education Forum in Dakar in the year 2000. And the year 2000 is key to the field of education emergencies, because a group of educators and practitioners linked mainly to international non-governmental organizations and UN agencies formed a network, and they called it the Interagency Network for Education Emergencies. And initially the aim the aim that was announced of that network is to support education in countries affected by conflict and disasters. Since then, the field of education emergencies has proliferated exponentially and became an industry that includes programmatic interventions, large funds, multi-sectoral and multidisciplinary research projects, global advocacy, policymaking, and international strategies. Now, the initial focus, as I mentioned before, of education emergencies was merely to look at access and encourage access to education in times of crises. And when I talk to education here, is mainly schooling. And with the increased interest and diversification of actors involved, the education emergency industry developed to include issues such as gender, human rights, peace education, conflict resolution, amongst others. Additionally, the need for education emergency research has increased to create evidence, or what they call evidence, for education in emergencies programming. Having been involved in this industry for around 10 years myself, there are always so many questions that I struggle with, particularly when it comes to the ethics of research within the industry of education emergencies. And three points that come to mind that I struggle with mostly. Firstly, the question of whose knowledge counts when it comes to education emergencies research. And do these programs that are based on this research reflect the needs and demands of those who are actually dealing with that particular emergency? And finally, who are the researchers assigned to design and conduct the research and actually own and analyze that data and use it for different purposes? So I'd like to start with the idea or the question of whose knowledge counts. The INE, or the Interagency Network for Education Emergencies, has a massive website and tens of thousands of members. And on their website, they have a timeline that includes education emergency work since 1948. And the efforts that are described in this timeline are linked mainly to the establishment of UN agencies, such as UNRWA, which is a UN agency responsible for Palestinian refugees in 1949, and UNHCR in 1915, and multiple UN declarations and conventions, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UN Convention of the Right of the Child of 1989. This kind of focus on UN agencies and conventions and declarations is called a Declarationist Approach, according to Zambilas and Keat. This Declarationist approach leads to the emission of theories, knowledges, and practices of communities across the globe. And here it's worth noting that during and after a disaster, it's the affected populations who take the initiative and carry the burden to ensure the continuation of education and the reestablishment or the reimagination of education systems. However, there's limited research or acknowledgement of these community efforts, where education and emergency work seems to be considered at all or considered valid only when supported technically or financially by global bodies such as UN agencies and INGOs. Education emergency is promoted by practitioners. If we can move go to the next slide, please. Thank you very much. Education emergencies is promoted by practitioners in terms of core humanitarian principles, which means that it is depoliticized, hence decontextualized. This is exacerbated by education emergencies' increased institutionalization, which allows for higher levels of standardization in education and emergency research. In general, education emergency research responds to changing global priorities for humanitarian intervention rather than actually what happens on the ground. And responds to emerging funding platforms. So you can see some of these funding platforms on the screen. These platforms are based on the assumption that education and schooling in particular, quote, is an imperative for crisis-hit families as they are struggling to keep their children safe and rebuild their lives, and is paramount to peace and development, end of quote. They also assume that, another quote, disseminating evidence-based research provide crucial guidance to governments, policymakers, practitioners, and civil society to design programs that can have a positive impact on the lives of children and youth in crisis settings, end of quote. These two statements are exemplars of the lack of criticality in this emerging industry, where the assumption is that education is neutral and limited to schooling, and where the violent face of schooling, particularly in crisis contexts, such as bullying, corporal punishment, discrimination, and xenophobia, are overlooked. The needs of teachers, parents, and students are overshadowed by the need for evidence demanded by governments, policymakers, and other institutions. This evidence is provided by funded education emergency research, where teachers, parents, and students are merely subjects and sources for primary data. Additionally, there is evidence that shows that unlike the education emergency industry claims, in cases of complex crises and extreme hardships, education as a priority drops. In these cases, and for the most marginalized, Maslow comes before Bloom. Through an independent research that was in Jordan, that was conducted by Dina Batshon and Yasmin Shahzadeh, they found that at times of crisis, access to education might be of least concern for refugees and other vulnerable communities. And that was during a COVID-19 lockdown. They found that access to food, healthcare, and cash assistance are crucial in order for families to consider any education intervention. Similarly, during the same period of lockdown, I conducted a research with my colleague Maha Shaib focusing on the experiences of teachers, students, and parents in Jordan, Lebanon, and the occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip. And the impact of the lockdown on access and quality of education. We found that students, particularly male students, who dropped out of school during complex crisis in the 3 geographical locations, did so to look for work to support their struggling families. These findings contradict with the narrative of the education and emergency research industry that pushes for education and schooling in particular as a mechanism to save lives, a narrative that calls for an increased funding for education emergency interventions during crisis. These interventions, in my opinion, are quick fixes and a smokescreen that cover institutional violations, structural discrimination, and inequalities that impact the most marginalized. If we go now for the next slide, you can see again the frameworks and platforms of funding that are emerging and re-emerging that support education emergency research. And according to these bodies, education emergency research, to be representative and inclusive, partnerships between North and South institutions are increasingly encouraged. However, whether North-South partnership initiatives are genuinely collaborative and mutually enriching needs a closer scrutiny. And about that, there are 2 interconnected issues that I'd like to highlight. Firstly, funding for international partnerships is provided by Northern donors or academic institutions. And project ideas are often conceptualized in Northern universities. As a result, collaborations between funding agencies and implementing partners in the context where the research is being done are usually unequal and unrepresentative of the interest and educational priorities. Additionally, conducting rigorous research in conflict-affected or crisis environments is difficult and often complicated by the fact that most of the lead researchers of these studies are foreign to the context in which they are working. Mario Novelli claims that such initiatives are neocolonial because donor countries select, define, and prioritize educational problems based on their own objectives and geopolitical interests. This is a reality, particularly within what has been dubbed as the Syrian refugee crisis. Maysoon Sukkariya and Stuart Tannock stated that the rise of the UK overseas Syrian refugee research industry is firmly tied to UK foreign policy agenda. In 2015, the UK government created a 5-year, $1.5 billion Global Challenges Research Fund, also known as GCRF, to support research that contributes to realizing UK aid strategy through, quote, high quality and equitable, end of quote, partnerships with academics in the Global South to create a global community of researchers who together can tackle global development challenges. Now, the GCRF funding is legally required to support the government's or the UK's aid agenda, which was revised in the same year, in 2015, to require that all foreign aid must directly serve the UK's national security and foreign policy interests. Controlling migration controlling the migration coming into the UK triggered by Syrian conflict was explicitly highlighted as a priority concern within this UK security agenda that links to the aid agenda. Now, some literature argues that these projects are also nothing but a support for Western academics to improve their expertise and prestige by getting a foothold in less developed higher education and research systems, or from her opinion, less developed, and embodying epistemic violence. And there's an example on this that I found was very striking. Now, following the explosion that took place or the Beirut blast in August 4th, 2020, some critical academics, researchers, and activists questioned the role of international community, particularly donor agencies and their implementing partners. On August 10th, a UK-based academic tweeted, "I don't think I've seen one response about Beirut from any of the GCRF projects that can concentrate on Lebanon." Another academic in the UK responded, "It's interesting, I have not seen much activity recently on the handles of other major data extracting projects." For me, it's striking that Western academics have no problem stating that these initiatives are nothing but major data extracting projects. These tweets further shatter the facade of the conscientious global North-based academics who direct the research work from afar, and as Sukkariya says, separated by a gulf of language, culture, and geography, as well as by the basic political economy of research production in the 21st century marketized university sector. So I just need one more minute. So what can be done considering all of this? There are a number of things that I think could be done to create a more humanized and humanizing and ethical education emergency research. And the issue of positionality or political reflexivity within positionality is one of the points that I'd like to highlight here. Where positionality enables us to question issues related to hierarchy and power, and I think Muzna alluded to that. Being aware of our positionality is vital to interrogate how knowledge and power structures impact the field of education, including structures, content, policies, and how research practices could harm the people we work with. Education emergency researchers, particularly those foreign to the context that they work in, should unlearn the conditionality of depoliticization. They need to have better historical awareness of the context about which knowledge is to be produced. It's imperative for researchers to ask why they are there. Why are they conducting this research in that particular context? What gives them the right to do so? And for what purpose? Researchers who are aware of that positionality are able to unlearn the assumptions about the context on which they are working and be open to relearning and acknowledging their biases. The process of knowledge and the process of acknowledging and problematizing our positionality requires commitment and strong ethical stance and standards that enable us to say no to working in particular contexts in which we might cause harm. It requires courage to acknowledge that knowledge does not flow in one direction. Unlearning researchers' position as the expert is imperative to end the hierarchies amongst researchers, such as the local international expert divide. And researchers need to use literature written and produced in the languages of the context and avoid the assumption that there is a vacuum in knowledge production. And there needs to be an acknowledgement that people's expertise and experiences and stories are not mere perceptions or general anecdotes, but representation of a deep understanding and the core for knowledge production and creation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, May. عندنا 15 دقيقة للنقاش والأسئلة. ممكن طرح الأسئلة من خلال خانة Q&A أو الفيسبوك. بس في سؤال موجود بالشات أو Q&A بدي أطرحه على الجميع لأنه بعتبر إنه سؤال مهم جدا. فالسؤال: كيف يمكن أن نصل إلى التشبيك بين الباحثين خصوصا في وقت الأزمات؟ وطبعا هذا السؤال مهم لأنه إحنا منطقتنا فرص التشبيك وإمكانيات التشبيك بين الباحثين ضعيفة جدا، ضئيلة جدا، وفي تراجع أو ممكن نقول إنها في تراجع ضمن طبعا الظروف بما في ذلك الجائحة وغير ذلك. فبدي ممكن أطلب من مزنة تبدأ بالإجابة وبعدين كل واحد فيكم إذا ممكن يقترح أو يعلق على هذا السؤال، أهمية التشبيك، يعني كيف يمكن التشبيك وأهمية التشبيك وأغراض التشبيك. راح أبدأ مع مزنة لأنها ذكرت هذا الموضوع بمداخلتها، وأظن آخر فكرة قدمته كانت إنه شو نوع المؤسسات اللي إحنا بنحتاجها في المنطقة. فمزنة، هل عندك تعليقات على هذا السؤال؟ تفضل.
يعني محرج إنه تطلبي أنت مني تعليق ساتني، لأنه طبعا المجلس العربي عم بيقود هيدا مسار التشبيك. ويمكن لحدا مثلي رافق إنه كنت بأول مؤتمر من مؤتمرات المجلس، كنت بعدني تلميذ الدكتوراه لهلا، قادرة أشوف قيمة التراكم يعني المؤتمر والأنشطة المختلفة، بأنه نقدر ننسج علاقات طويلة الأمد بالعمل مع بعض، ونشوف حتى فكريا كيف من مؤتمر لمؤتمر أو قادرين نراقب كيف عمل المجلس ساهم بتشكيل شيء يمكن كمان مخيال جماعي آخر لكيف بدنا تكون العلوم الاجتماعية. بس إضافة لكل فرص التشبيك بهالطريقة، واحد من الأماكن اللي أنا بلاقيها دائما ناقصة هو التعاون البحثي. بمعنى مش تعاون فيني أقدم ورقة وأتشاركها مع آخرين، بس كتير قليلة أو ما بعرف إذا أنا عندي علم إنه في فرص لنتعاون كباحثين مع بعض على موضوع مشترك في أكثر من بلد عربي، بس تحت إطار تنسيقي كمان عربي. يعني كثير من التنسيق منا بيمرق عبر لندن ورجوع، أو بيكون مركزه حدا من الباحثين اللي أخذوا تمويل اللي عم تحكي عنهم مي أبو مغلي. هيدا واحد منهم. الشيء الثاني اللي هو متعلق بصعوبة اللقاء اليوم، قصة اللغة العربية طبعا، وكيف فينا نقدر نفتح مجال أكثر للترجمات، حتى لو إنه مجبرين مرات بعدنا عم نكتب بلغات أجنبية، للترجمات أو للكتابة باللغة العربية، لأنه هيدا بيفتح مجال أكثر للتعاون. الشيء الثالث في المجلس العربي، وأنا ما كنت أعرف عنه، عامل في قائمة بكل الدوريات اللي باللغة العربية. القائمة مهمة طبعا أكيد، بس في جانب تاني ممكن كتير يكون مساعد إنه يكون عنا قاعدة بيانات نقدر نبحث بمضمون هيدي الدوريات، لنقدر نستخدم عمل بعض بشكل أكثر، خاصة الموجود بالعربي. بيسهل علينا نلاقي المراجع باللغة الإنجليزية بس مش بنفس السهولة بالعربي. هدول اقتراحات سريعة.
شكرا مزنة. ريم، عندك أي أفكار حول التشبيك وأهمية التشبيك، خاصة في ظل مثلا بالنوستالجيا، يعني في مجال النوستالجيا، مجال الأرشيف. يعني إحنا بنشوف بالمنطقة إنه في نشاط أرشفة كبيرة وفي اهتمام كبير بالأرشفة بمعانيها المختلفة. شو أهمية التشبيك بين الأفراد وبين هاي المشاريع والمشاريع الأرشفة مثلا؟
بعتقد يعني هحاول أحكي بالعربي، بس يمكن هتكلم بالإنجليزي. وبعتقد أنا صعوبتي إني أعبر عن المصطلحات أو استخدام المصطلحات اللي استعملتها بمداخلتي. بعتقد بحاجة لجلوسري، يعني بعتقد glossary of terms نقدر نحن كلنا نتفق عليها، نقدر نستخدمها بشكل مشترك. لأنه أنا كباحثة حابة أكتب باللغة العربية وحابة أعمل بحث باللغة العربية. في كتير قصص يا أما مش منا متأكدين كيف نترجمها، أو ما في conclusive، يعني إنه مش عارفين شو المصطلح اللي بدنا نستعمله. هيدا الشيء بيساعد كتير إنه لما بدنا نحكي عن أو نشوف شو عم تعمل هالمشاريع ونشبك بيناتهم. هيدا أول شيء. وتاني شيء إنه يكون في يعني مؤسسة مثل العرب Council for Social Sciences، مثل يعني يعطوا مساحة للمشاريع الصغيرة لحتى تقدر، يعني في كتير مشاريع أشرفة عم تحصل بشكل مش institutionalized، يعني مش ما وراهم حدا، هن أفراد، هن مجموعات صغيرة عم تجي مع بعضها وعم بتحاول يعني عم تعمل شغل، بس ما عندها مجال إنه يعني to publicize its work. ما بتعرف مع مين تحكي، حتى إذا بدها to publicize its work، إذا بدهم يحكوا بفورمز أو يعملوا مداخلات يمكن ما يعطوهم الفرصة ليحكوا، فكمان هذا الشيء إنه ممكن يساعد.
شكرا ريم. مي، بالإضافة لمسألة التشبيك في سؤالين موجهين إليك. أول سؤال بالإنجليزي: to what extent are local curricula related to globally dominant discourses؟ فمسألة العلاقة بين المناهج التدريسية بالمنطقة والاهتمامات العالمية أو الأولويات اللي تسمى عالمية. وفي سؤال على في سؤال كان معلش تفضلي وأنا بدور بلاقي السؤال الثاني اللي كان موجه لحضرتك.
شكرا لك. ما إنه في سؤالين رح أجاوب سريعاً، ولأنه زميلاتي حكوا كتير عن موضوع التشبيك، أنا بس بدي أحكي 3 نقاط أساسية. أولاً المشكلة بالمجموعات التشبيكية اللي بتصير بالمنطقة تبعتنا أو بالدول الناطقة باللغة العربية، أنا بحسها شخصياً مرات بتكون إقصائية. يعني كتير من الصعوبة زي بيصير تخلق هاي المساحات جمعية ولكنها بتصير كأنه هن حراس المعرفة، وبصير من الصعوبة إنه الواحد يخترقها. فممكن إنه نفكر لما نخلق هاي التجمعات سواء كانت متخصصة بحقول أو interdisciplinary متعددة الحقول، إنه تكون أكثر جمعية وقادرة على إنها يعني تتقبل أشخاص من جميع المستويات، سواء كانت الأكاديمية أو وين بيشتغلوا بالحقل، سواء هن كانوا مهنيين practitioners أو أكاديميين. وكمان على موضوع المهنيين أو العاملين أو الأكاديميكس، إنه كمان يكون في تقبل لإنتاج معرفة بشكل مش محدد بالشكل الأكاديمي. يعني ما نطلع إنه أنا إذا بدي أكتب مقالة لازم أطلع على المصادر المكتوبة بشكل أكاديمي سواء كان بالعربي أو بالإنجليزي أو بأي لغة تانية، ولكن نطلع على مصادر فنية أو مصادر مختلفة، مدونات صوتية، مدونات مكتوبة، إنه نقدر كمان نكسر حاجز الكتابة الأكاديمية عشان نقدر نكون أكثر قادرين على جمع أكثر عدد من الأشخاص اللي بيقدروا ينتجوا معرفة بأشكال مختلفة. ثاني نقطة أو ثالث نقطة، دور الجامعات. دور الجامعات في منطقتنا عم بتحيد وعم بقل مع خصخصة التعليم العالي، وصار دور الجامعة بس إنها تنتج أفراد يدخلوا على سوق العمل، سواء كانت النوعية تبعت الأفراد اللي عم يدخلوا على سوق العمل، نوعية التعليم الموجودة هي جيدة أو لا، هذا إشي تاني. بس دور الجامعة عم تقريبا بنتهي بخلق المعرفة، لأنه أول إشي الأستاذ أو المعلمة بالجامعة ما عندهم وقت غير إنهم يفوت على الصف يعلم ويصلح وراء، ما عنده أو ما عندها وقت ليفكروا ويبحثوا وينتجوا معرفة. والطلاب دورهم برضو إنه يدوب يفوتوا يعملوا امتحان ويطلعوا يفوتوا على سوق العمل. فبرضو هذا الدور كمان لازم نفكر فيه بطريقة نقدية ونحاول إن نغيره. وهذا كمان كتير مهم لموضوع التشبيك، لأن الجامعات هي مساحات كتير كبيرة فيها كتير أشخاص ممكن يلعبوا دور كتير كبير بموضوع التشبيك. بالنسبة لموضوع المناهج والاهتمامات العالمية والأولويات، يعني مش عارفة إذا هذا المحل نحكي فيه. actually إحنا بكرة عندنا مؤتمر عن المناهج، بس أنا بالنسبة إلي مشكلة المناهج في المنطقة هي إنها برضو مثلها مثل البحث كتير مرتبط بالتمويل، والتمويل مشروط. إذا بنطلع على مناهج مثلا التربية المدنية السيفكس education اللي مرتبطة بالتمويل، اللي هي بتحكي عن قيم كتير مهمة، فيها ضغط من الممول إنه يتم إدخال أو الإضاءة على بعض القيم اللي هي universalist العالمية، بغير مش أخذين بعين الاعتبار الأولويات الموجودة بالمنطقة أو بالبلد المعينة أو بالتجمعات المعينة أو باهتمامات الأشخاص أو التجمعات أو المجتمعات. فمثلا هاي واحدة من النقاط اللي هي إشكالية بالمناهج بمنطقتنا. طبعا في إشكاليات كبير، بس إذا هاي بدي أربطها بالاهتمامات الأولويات العالمية، موضوع مهارات القرن ال21، بنضلنا نسمعها بس ما بنعرف شو معناها وليش الممول عم بدفشها علينا وشو بتعني بالسياقات تبعتنا. فبرضه هذا وحدة تانية ربطا بين المناهج والأولويات العالمية. ما بعرف إذا جاوبت السؤال.
شكرا لكم، داهمنا الوقت وبدي أعطي إلياس دقيقتين يحكي لنا عن الجلسة القادمة. يعني أثرتوا كتير مواضيع مهمة وطبعا ما بتخلص يعني بحلقة واحدة أو بجلسة واحدة، ما بنقدر نناقشها كلها. ومن أهم النقاط اللي برزت يعني من مداخلاتكم هي مسألة التمبوراليتيز أو مسألة الزمنية، إنه الزمن المطلوب للبحث، الزمن المطلوب للكتابة، الزمن المطلوب للتفكير وللمناقشة وإلى آخره، ومقابله طبعاً حالة الطوارئ وحالة الأزمة وحالة الشعور بأنه لازم نلاقي حلول، لازم نساعد، لازم نلاقي أجوبة للأسئلة. يعني أظن هذا وضع غير مريح، وضع صعب جدا لأي باحث ولا أي مفكر ولا أي كاتب، وهذا وضع رح يكون معنا لزمن طويل. يعني مش رح نقدر نطلع من هذه الأزمة. يعني هذه الأزمة معنا لمراحل طويلة، وإن شاء الله بالمجلس ومعاكم ومن خلال دراساتكم ومن خلال أفكاركم نقدر نعالج هذا السؤال المهم جدا في جلسات مقبلة. شكرا لكم جميعا، وبحول الكلمة لإلياس عشان ننهي هذه الجلسة.
نهاية الحلقة الأولى. شكرا للمتحدثات ولجميع من انضم إلينا. نعود ونلتقي بعد نصف ساعة في تمام الساعة 4 بتوقيت بيروت في حلقة النقاش الثانية حول المنصات النسوية، وفيها نستضيف الأستاذات هدى الصدى وديما قائد بي ولينا أبو حبيب، وطبعا الدكتورة ستة شامي باقية معنا. كونوا معنا باستخدام الرابط نفسه عبر زوم، وطبعا سنبث الحلقة على صفحة المجلس في فيسبوك Arab Council for the Social Sciences. نلقاكم بعد قليل. إلى اللقاء.